I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. It's my pleasure to talk to two of my favorite people, Chris Munro, John Campbell. I've probably learned more from the two of you than just about anybody when it comes to coaching and other things as well. John, you've become probably the person I talk to the most about many things in and about, around coaching, but life in general is a part of our topic. And Chris, as you know, you were whisked away by growth coaching just when I was starting to figure out how I could get you to work for ICG. And I know you're doing amazing things. Two of you have written this book, and I wanted us to talk about this book and then maybe talk a bit about TLC after that. And I love the idea of the book. I think it's just a phenomenal thing, and I can't wait to hear what you're thinking and hear more about it. But your book is essentially about coaching as a way of leading. And I'm wondering if you could tell me what you mean by that. What is coaching as a way of leading?
Yeah, look, it's this book had a long kind of genesis. We've been thinking about this for a while. We kind of read about leadership in complex systems, and people were saying things about how that was a bit different from the way we thought about organizations. And we thought, yeah, school's really a good example of these kind of complex systems. And then the research started to say things like, the people that really have influence in these organizations are people who do these kind of things. They have really compelling vision. They are able to bring a level of engagement to the way things are discussed and talked about. They have a focus on moving things forward, on a sense of progress. And then there are other things emerging from various other different bits of research. I can reference them all if people want to follow it up, that were saying very coach-like things. And these weren't coaching people. And they were saying, if we want to lead well in these kind of organizations, how we look at them now, it's a whole lot of coaching-like practices that seem to be really hitting the mark. That was the start of it. And so we started to think that, hey, coaching seems to be a really good fit way of leading in the way people are talking about organizations now and what makes them work well. That was how it started. So, what does it look like? Chris might want to sort of comment on that a little, and I can add something too as we go into this more if you want to go to that point now.
Yeah, I think there's just a couple of words I would add that I think have emerged over the time we've been doing this, John and Jim. It's lovely to hear you say we've written this book because we're nearly over the line now with it. It's been a long time kind of cooking this up and making sense of these concepts. I think there's three kind of phrases, John, that sum that up. One is complexity, and we don't need to tell educators how complex the work is. I remember at a keynote a long time ago, Jim, you said, I think it might have been Richard Elwood, you were quoting about, teaching is not rocket science, it's more complex than that. It's not complicated, it's complex. And the other phrase, I think, from the complex adaptive system stuff, John, that we've landed on in our writing is that schools are human-intensive organizations, and they're uniquely human-intensive in some ways because their work is so highly relational between the adults and between the children and everything in between. So I think that's the thing, that the proposition is this coaching as a way of leading sits with that wider research, but it also resonates so strongly with our experience of how schools are and how we want to relate with educators and children. So it's in that human intensive kind of sense.
If leaders use a coaching way of leading, what's that actually look like?
Sometimes, we talk about examples and non-examples. It's easier to talk about a non-example of this first, because sometimes there's a misinterpretation here that this means every conversation is a coaching conversation. So it's not. If every conversation becomes a coaching conversation with a leader, you drive people crazy because all of a sudden you don't have anything to give them. It's lots of questions, and and sometimes that's not appropriate. And it's also not about leader as coach. I used to use that term regularly and so on, but what it tended to convey was the leader is now being a coach in the same way as an instructional coach or a leadership coach, and I'm doing formal coaching cycles. Leaders don't have time to do that. And there's also that power and status difference. So it's not about that. So what is it? Answer your question. It's about essentially being a more effective leader of conversations. And what that means is being more discerning and intentional in two things. One, how we show up. So I notice the context, notice what's happening for the other person here, and I show up in a particular way with curiosity and respect and all those kind of things. And also what I do in that conversation. So does this need some input from me? Does it need just an open-ended question from me? Does it need me just to be quiet and listen and hear more first? So I'm being very intentional in how I show up, how I operate in the conversations. And that links to the initial premise that we've talked about here, that leadership is enacted through conversations. In organizations like schools, other education settings, we lead through conversation. So essentially, coaching as a way of leading is being more intentional and discerning in how we show up in a whole range of conversational contexts. And that we see more of those as opportunities to support the learning and progress of our conversation partners. So we're starting to think about these interactions as conversation leader and conversation partner. How can I best serve them? That's essentially what it's about.
Yeah, just to add to that a touch, I mean, what would it look like in terms of sort of practices you'd see? It'd be the sort of things we see perhaps in more formal coaching conversational contexts, applied in situations where we normally necessarily wouldn't have applied them in the past. So it brings things like an emphasis on what's wanted here, what's the goal here, what's the outcome we might be working towards, drawing attention to that. But then all those other things around good questions that we ask, really kind of good listening for what's going on to help the other person clarify. And I would add, sort of movement or progress. That would be the things I would see in those kind of conversations as well.
Well, and I'm hearing that not every conversation is a coaching conversation. There's times you have to be directive because something's happening and you have to clearly communicate that what has to change. And there are times when you might be more dialogical, times more facilitative. I think sometimes the problem is with leadership, this is just my take, and I'm curious to see if you agree with this, but the problem is that people have never been given the opportunity to expand the repertoire they have of ways of communicating. So they think they always need to be directive or they always need to be facilitative. And so it seems to me if I'm a leader and I have I think of it as kind of a quarterback on a football team. You look at the defense and you figure out, what am I going to do this time? What's the most appropriate way for me to interact? And if I have someone who's a toxic force on a team, who's really browbeating people, bullying kids, I might have to just go say, look, that's got to stop. And then if I have a different situation where I'm not really trying to stop a behavior, I'm trying to facilitate, as you said, a learning conversation, then I could take a coaching approach. But having said that, the skills of a coach, noticing, listening, asking good questions are going to help you probably in any conversation. It's not you're never going to say, I wish I wasn't as good a listener as I am. I mean, your probably listening is always going to help. So does that make sense what I'm saying? That a leader who's taking coaching as leading approach, it sort of has different ways of reading the situation and responding? Or is it more just that, is that how you see it? It's probably a leading question, but ignore it if it doesn't carry on. Yeah,
definitely. Just a brief bit. I think the first thing you said there, I think, is really important, that the extension of not every conversation is a coaching conversation depends on what you think a coaching conversation is first. So there's a bit, and you've just described those different stances that we talk about, and that comes up in the book. I think that's been really, really helpful. And that I've built on your work and others as we've developed that. And for me, you can be more directive sometimes in a learning conversation still, where they just need a bit more of me. They don't know what they don't know. You're raising their awareness, or you're sharing or offering something and then moving dialogically into that discussion and sense making together. But there are absolutely times as a leader, not as many as we sometimes think, but there are times when what I like to describe it as there are misaligned expectations. For me, those absolutely direct conversations, or directive, if you want to say directive, sorry, Jim, you've dropped the ball. That's not how we do things around here. I'm concerned that I saw this and that's not appropriate in this situation. And basically what I'm conveying to you there is our expectations as an organisation or as a team are out of step with what I've just heard or seen you do. And those absolutely need to happen. There's a whole skill set around that. And you're right, they are supported by showing up in a more coach-like way, but they are certainly not beginning as learning conversations. But as soon as you go, oh no, didn't get the best of me that day. Yeah, I did. Yeah, that can move to a coaching place and say, well, how do we want it to be? What would you like to do about it? But initially, it might not. It might be oh no, I don't see it that way. It might be more contentious. So I think what we're writing about is not that far end of, these, what you might call challenging, fierce, hard, whoever's book you read, you'll get a different title. But sometimes more of the leader in a learning conversation means just a bit more of my knowledge, a bit more perspective. It's not always stuff I know, it's perspective. But that's not the same as one of those directive leadership conversations, I think. But all of it is helped by, showing up in ways and operating in ways where you are, for example, more curious, that you're managing, you're noticing your own tendencies just to wag your finger and scold people, and you're being more coach-like. So I think there is something in there under that about even a coaching way of operating in those conversations, but they are further to the right on that continuum, I suppose, than what we're talking about here. John, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the discernment thing's really critical here, Jim, when you're talking about this range of responses. And just 2 quick points. I think we sometimes feel like the more directive is the quickest way, and I think that's just not always the case. And sometimes taking the more facilitative end, if we look at that, can actually end up being quicker in the long run, and also more engaging for both people in terms of the relationship as well. So the discernment and flexibility, I guess, are 2 words that are probably helpful here as you think about that range of situations you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I'm thinking that when you take the directive approach, and correct me if you don't see it this way, but when you take the directive approach, it's really about either stopping or starting something. It's not really a learning conversation that we're going to explore things together. It's like you're doing this thing and it has to stop, or you're not doing this thing and it has to start. Whereas a coaching conversation is when we're sort of entering into the thinking with the person to help them figure it out. And in the quote I always go back to, I don't know where I heard this first, is, but you can't force people to learn. You can say, in this setting, you can't treat people that way. Or you can say, if you're going to work here, these are things you have to do. But often the kind of conversation is one where you want the person to be excited about a goal and move forward, and then you need a kind of a coaching approach. Does that resonate with what you guys are finding?
So I think so. And what you're describing there is raising their awareness of the issue and going in with that, I suppose, generosity, maybe a bit of Brené Brown I'm challenging there. I'm channeling there that, you go in making a generous assumption, but sometimes it's toxic behavior in the staff room, it's whatever, and you're calling that out, and you're hoping not that they walk out the door. You're hoping that you raise their awareness to the point where they accept responsibility for it, at which point it becomes a learning opportunity. But until they see it as a learning opportunity and see it as something that needs to change, you may as well coach the wall if you want to try and coach that out of them. So it does require that more directive approach at that time. Yeah,
I've never heard that phrase, coaching the wall, but I'm going to remember that one. That's I'm afraid people might have felt that way about me a few times. So central to the structure of your book is the idea of the learning conversations map. So what is this thing and how does it work?
Okay, so the first thing to say about that is it's difficult to convey. Well, I'm going to try, but it's a nuanced kind of dynamic concept that kind of needs an illustration or an animation. So I'll try and kind of just illustrate a little bit. But in essence, what it is a kind of theoretical framework or visual structure that is designed to help identify, organize, and bring intentionality to the range of conversational contexts in which a leader engages, I should say. So if the concept is coaching as a way of leading is bringing coaching skills and techniques to the myriad of conversational contexts through which leadership is enacted, the map offers a way of thinking about those, sense-making around those, one of the principles underpinning this. And what the basic premise is there are 2 axes. The horizontal axis is the one we've just talked about, where it's the stance of the conversation leader. So when I'm leading a conversation, I'm thinking about, does this need me to be more facilitative or more directive or more dialogical, and do I shift in amongst that conversation during it? So does it need more of me or less of me at any stage in the conversation? So that's the first piece of discernment. But then as we looked at the conversations where we were applying that, we realized that the other thing that influences the nature of those conversations is the degree of formality. So there's a vertical axis now that says, is this conversation up at the top more formal in terms of context or predetermined structure? So annual goal setting conversations with team members, review and development conversations, or even formal coaching cycles. There are boundaries, there are so many cycles, there's so many sessions and so on. So some were more formal, but then there were an awful lot of conversations that a leader engages in, or interactions a leader engages in their day-to-day work, that are what John and I have kind of inadvertently called below the line conversations. They're the bottom half of the map, that are more incidental, less planned, no formal structure around them. So they're less formal, and sometimes they're initiated by the other person. You know, you rock up to me in the corridor, Jim, and I might be an instructional coach, I might be your team leader, I might be the principal, and you say, have you got a minute, Chris? And I've done no planning for it, I don't know what the agenda is, it's completely informal. And you start talking, and in the moment, I've got to make sense of, is this a learning conversation? How can I help this person think and make progress? And then the other kind of bottom right quadrant of this, if you can visualize this, is still informal, but I might bump into you, or I might email you after we've had a team meeting, and I might say, Jim, could we have a chat tomorrow? I'd like to talk about this. And it might be to give you some affirming feedback, but it might be to give you something I've noticed that I think would be good to raise your awareness of, or it might be to move forward on a project we've been working on, you know. So those bottom ones about being other initiated or leader initiated have actually shown us being really powerful opportunities, but sometimes ones we miss to lead and support the learning and progress of the other person. And I think, John, you'd agree that that's become the main focus of the book.
Yeah.
There's all those other less formal contexts.
And the map just gives, and the feedback we've had on it as we've tested it out in some of the workshops we've run has been really, really positive, and just kind of giving people a way to handle things, a way to look at them in a more organized way, as Chris was saying. And that's been helpful in itself. And then the bottom half is where we focus. Those more incidental ones, and we think they fill up. Maybe 60%, you know, of a day for many people, many in leadership roles. It's a big part of how people work, and so that's what we're trying to help people with.
So I want to see if I can visualize this. So there's formal and informal, and there's facilitative and directive. Oh. Is that really? And then there's in between facilitative and directive, there could be dialogical, and there's it's kind of like a continuum too. It's sort of formal, semi-formal.
Exactly. Right. I think the words I would add there, Jim, are, because words like directive and non-directive, or formal and informal, are kind of absolute.
Right.
So what we tend to talk about is more directive, less directive, more formal, less formal. So that means that some conversations might sit closer to the center and some might sit further out. So a good example of that might be when I'm talking to a principal and I talk about the performance and development conversations that they maybe have each year with team or a team leader. And you ask how they are just now, and they say, it's way too much of me in that conversation. It's meant to be about the teacher setting their goals and my team member setting their goals and talking about their development. And it's just them coming into this formal process, telling me what I want to hear, and we tick the box. And then I'll say, well, how would you like it to be? And they start to describe how they want that conversation to shift to a more dialogic space. But right now it feels really directive. So it's become a really useful framework for helping people think about where they would like conversations to sit most of the time, or where they might want them to shift over time. And that, I think that's the dynamic nature of it, that it's not silos where we stick conversations in each of these 4 buckets. Or silos. It's actually helping think about the dynamic nature of these interactions, where they start and where they might end up in a constructive way.
So I'm thinking there might be people listening to this and say, well, this all sounds really nice, this kind of coaching conversations and so forth, but I'm just really busy. How's this going to help me not just have this be one more thing I've got to do? Given I honestly don't know anybody who's busier than a school principal or administrator or even an instructional coach in a school. When we did the study on instructional coaching last year for TLC, I asked a research assistant, what's the thing you've noticed? And he said, well, they've got to be really good at time management because things are coming at them all places. So how does this book help people not have this just be one more thing I've got to do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we acknowledge that. We do recognize the complexity and the pace of those roles, and probably even more so post-pandemic, I think. But what we come to is really the whole conversational thing again. And this is something that really is a big part of your day. You're doing this all the time. So what we want to say is, here's some ways to do it that we think give it a little more intentionality, a little more focus, a little more crispness, maybe, to it. I mean, in fact, one person had been talking about, I really want to have more efficient conversations. Chris has a story about this, and that sounds like a pretty almost harsh word in some ways, but actually that's a pretty good way. What we think happens, we think by thinking about it in a way, seeing the map, being discerning, these kind of things we're talking about, actually give you a way to do what you're already doing a bit more crisply. I'll use that word again. So we think that's the way we respond to that question. And so it doesn't mean a whole lot of extra stuff, but things that you do in a whole lot of the practices you're engaged in right away that you're probably doing pretty well already. But here's a few things that really can give some edge to the way you do that and help you do it better and faster and more productively and more relationship enhancing ways too, we think as well.
Definitely. Yeah. And from that comes enhanced well-being and all the other positive benefits that we see in formal coaching. This is what we're trying to amplify in these shorter conversations, I suppose, brief conversations. I think John's word crispness is actually a good word that's emerged. Maybe that'll find its way in there somewhere. But efficient as well doesn't mean abrupt, in a hurry, let's move you on. But these are conversations leaders are already having, regardless of your position of leadership. This is about, intentionality is the word we come to again, that you're actually utilizing the skills that you already have, you're honing them and deploying them in more discerning ways. And what that does is help that person move forward in their thinking, more efficiently, more crisply.
So I think we sometimes think that if the work we do has to be short and focused, and the conversation itself, I think that's true. It can be, these things can help do that, but it's what comes after that is actually quite critical. So if people come out of these interactions and they're more energized and they're more focused and there's real stuff happening that wasn't going to happen if the conversation wasn't handled this way, you've got a whole ripple effect thing there that really makes your work easier. And it's hard to quantify that. I'm not sure I've explained it all that well, but I actually think we sometimes think it's just that moment. What am I doing with this 10 minutes with this person? But if we do that 10 minutes well, the flow on from that can be, quite significant.
The opposite's also true.
Yes.
You can spend 10 minutes, screw up the conversation, and then pay for it for the rest of the year. And so it can take a massive amount of time because despite what your intentions might be, it may not have been the right thing to say or the right way to process it. So to give us more skills to help us do those conversations. I like this term crisp. I've never used this before. Crisp is, I think of that with my food, not so much my conversations, but more efficient, more effective. It can, in the long run, really save you a lot of time. And it is what you're already doing anyway, for sure.
Yeah. In fact, this is an evidence base for this too. We're not just sort of sharing some anecdotal stuff here. There is some stuff that talks about the positive energizers in organizations in the way that we've been talking. And there's also the negative energizers, which is what you've been mentioning there as well. And there is a price to pay or a gain to be realized, in either way we respond to those situations.
So what would you say are some specific takeaways leaders could take from the book?
I mean, essentially, Jim, what we're doing is, as I'm about to say this, I'm thinking it through like a coach. Is this really what we're doing? Is, I sometimes say distilling, but we're extracting the key skills and techniques, tools, framework.
I know why you're saying this.
You know why I was saying
I know
distilling.
Where this
I know it's
coming.
just in the blood. It's there. Yeah, there's a few bottles up here. We need to have that whiskey tasting session. Anyway, it's extracting the key tools and frameworks and techniques that we know work to support people's thinking, simple things. You've talked before about the power of just the right question at the right time, or the things that we listen for, and tuning our listening in certain conversational situations. In some ways, that's easier to do in formal coaching situations where you're being the coach. What this is about learning how to use those tools and frameworks in a more discerning and intentional way as leaders of conversation. So there are lots of skills and techniques in there, but the key thing is, how do we bring those to a 5-minute conversation in the corridor? And two of the biggest takeaways I want people to take from this is increased confidence and increased awareness. And that sounds like fuzzy or intangible things, but really this is what you get. The more you do this, the more confident and aware you become, and you start to become a conversation leader, a better conversation leader, not a coach, not a mentor, not an instructional coach, a more effective leader of conversations. And I think we're trying to present a range of skills and techniques that really focus right down to scenarios and scripts, if you like, not scripts for the conversation, but illustrations of how this will actually look, or spend a lot of time on that. John, would you add anything more?
Yeah, I'll add one too. I mean, just to sort of take that awareness thing a little further and sort of specify something around that. I think a really good takeaway would be that, hey, I can make a difference in a small amount of time. So that I don't need an hour. I mean, that might be great, and let's do that. But a 10-minute conversation can be quite significant in moving something forward. Even, I would say, and it gets used a lot, this word transformational. Not everyone, but I think that's an attitude shift that I think we really would like to see people walk away with here. Hey, my moments that I thought were almost wasted time or little interruptions or whatever can actually be potentially significant and make a difference.
Do you have a title for the book?
Yeah, there's a working title, Growth Talk, which picks up on some things that we're trying to emphasize, and the sub, which relates to a bit of the framework we've used in our conversations, and also the idea of movement and learning is inherent in that. But the subtitle is up for grabs a little bit at the moment. It captures what I was just talking about: small conversations or brief conversations, big impact.
I love
sort of subtitle we're working on.
There's a few variations in there, but that captures it, John, I think. Yeah.
Well, I've liked the Growth Talk for years, but I wasn't sure if you're sticking with the title. But I think it's a great title. If you had to sum up Growth Talk in 1 or 2 sentences, what would you say?
I'm tempted to pick up on what you just said there, John. And it's, again, every time we talk this through like this, there's little bits that you go, that's it. And what you said there about transformational conversations, I don't think it's too big a reach, too big a pledge from us to say this is about making more conversations more transformational and less transactional. I think a lot of conversations, those brief ones in particular, for leaders, become transactional. And there's more and more and more of them. If we can make them more transformational for the people around us, that means we're helping them do their best thinking and make progress. And if everyone's moving in that direction in an organization, then that starts to shift culture as well. So I don't think that's too big a pledge. I think that's what we're going for in this.
Yeah, I think that's true, Chris. And I would just maybe add, we've had a long-term value in our organization that things needed to be, in our workshops particularly, immediately useful. You can take something from a workshop and use it in interactions you're going to have the next day. That's a really important value for us. We try to capture that in the book as well. So while we talk about conceptualizing things that can sound sometimes a bit abstract, I think that's a helpful foundation to kind of reorientate people. Yes, this map can be helpful. Yes, small conversations can make a big difference. They're important concepts that we want to get across. But we've also got a bunch of tactics and specifics that sort of flesh out how that can happen. So it's got some conceptual things to think about, but it's really got a whole bunch of practical takeaways that you can use, the interactions that you're going to have with parents or team leaders or kids in the playground, tomorrow.
Here's my 2 sentences based on what I've been hearing in our conversations prior to this, is that how to use more than 2 decades of experience in coaching to have a better conversation in a couple minutes. That's kind of it. You guys have been working on coaching for decades, written about this previously in all kinds of contexts, presented all across Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia. And now you're saying all we learned, you can apply it in 1 or 2 brief conversations, short conversations. So that's my summing up. As I was putting it.
Good to me. We'll get you to write that down somewhere, Jim.
Yeah.
We've got it recorded.
I like the sound of that one, Jim. I think we can use that. Yeah.
The only thing is it wasn't 1 or 2 sentences, so I wasn't really listening to my question. So if you could give us 1 or 2 strategies, questions, techniques, things that coaches could use, picking up on what you said, John, right away, that they could use tomorrow, what are a couple suggestions you've got? 1 or 2 would be great from each of you.
Well, I've got one here that is referred to in the book, and we explore this. And it's just this simple kind of checklist, if you like, that we hold, what, and we distill it down to these 3 questions that we think are useful to bring to these moments. What's wanted here? Can I help this person get clear on what's wanted? Sometimes people are really, really clear on what they don't want in a situation. So we try and get that clear. And that's a question. What do you really want to see happen here? Or what's most on your mind about this, and what would you like to be different about it? So an emphasis on that. What's wanted, what's already working is the second thing. Usually there's some things that people have got to build on, and we want to draw that out. Often they can just see what's not working. We want to draw attention to the what's working, and then what's next. We want to have some progress. We want to have some movement in either thinking or understanding, or even a physical or next step action that people can take. So I think that's a useful, simple little framework. What's wanted, what's working, what's next.
Oh, that's great. Chris?
Brilliant. And that dovetails, we didn't plan this, but that dovetails with the thing that came to my mind first as well, John. In order to do that well, when you ask for a most basic thing, Jim, sometimes for me, it's about tuning your listening. And you've heard me talk about this before. What I mean by that is, in order to do what John's just said, that person might be standing in front of you in the corridor at the school gate telling you about everything that's wrong and everything they don't want. What are you listening for within that? So I'm listening for what's wanted underneath the story they're telling me. I'm listening for strengths and resources. When they talk about didn't used to be like this. Okay, so what was that? And what you're then doing is you're intentionally redirecting them to, it's very much solution focused kind of practice, but actually tuning your listening and starting to retune your listening. I talk about your listening radar, if you like, what you're getting the pings on your radar for now, whereas conventionally you'd have been listening for the problem. You'd have been listening for things you can fix. You've been listening for opportunities to give advice. One of the things you can start to do straight away is start to listen differently. Let's tune your radar to different things. Dial some things up, dial some things down. And that allows you to do the kind of reflecting back and reframing that John's talking about.
So you're coming to TLC. What can we see when you guys come to TLC? What's the presentations you've got planned? Not to mention they can just meet you and talk and have like a 2-minute great coaching conversation. But in addition to the conversations, what's planned? And maybe we're not clear on what's going to happen just yet. It's still a few months off.
Well, I think one of the things we really wanted to highlight is just some of the things we're talking about in the latter part here. Right. That in these brief interactions, what does it look like to help one of those shorter time frame conversations achieve something significant and move something forward? So there'll be things we explore around that in terms of elaborating on some of the things we've just mentioned, the frameworks we talked about, and so on. Giving people a chance to play with that and see it work. That's something we like to do in any workshop we run. That okay, this is all just talk, but let's do it and see. And then I think if people have the experience of talking through in a 10-minute, sample practice kind of opportunity, suddenly they say, hey, this can work. I'm in a different place than where I was 6 or 7 minutes ago with this topic, and it's been bugging me for a while. And here I'm doing it. I'm not perfect at it, but it's been worthwhile. So I think some experience of what we're talking about here. So it's not just abstract, is what you get to do in a live situation. I'm looking for that. It's good to talk about it like this, but it's nothing better than seeing it work and experiencing it working. And that's what we want to do in the sessions we're going to be leading.
Definitely. Yeah, it's the same. I think, John, we've got a couple planned, Jim, where we're going, no surprise, we're going to be talking about this stuff. But one that I'm going to be looking at, the leader-initiated quadrant, the bottom right. And John and I will be looking at the bottom left quadrant, which is the in-the-moment conversations, those ones where you come up and say, have you got a minute, John? And start talking. And we actually model those. We've been modeling those in workshops for a while now, and it's great for people to see, wow, that was only 5 minutes. And look where we got to. So completely unscripted. We'll demonstrate both of these live and help people practice and dig into them. Yeah.
Well, I can't wait. I know, having presented with both of you and 3 different continents now, I think, how you run these things is that people walk away with practical tools that they've actually tried out, and then they've got some experience, and it's just energizing to see people try the activities out. I'm grateful to both of you because ICG is the exclusive provider of GCI workshops. So these ideas you're learning about, you can learn from the instructional coaching group. We've got an introduction to leadership coaching course we offer virtually and face-to-face, which is fun to do and super practical and powerful. So I'm grateful for all I've learned from you. I'm not exaggerating to say I've learned more from GCI and the people at GCI about coaching in the last decade than anywhere else. So I'm grateful you're making me just significantly improve, but the low baseline when we started, but we're making some progress thanks to the two of you. So thank you both so much.
Thanks, Jim. Good to talk always.
Yeah.